One autumn weekend, I decided to hike alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. The trail, known as the Hermit's Path, was secluded and difficult to navigate, attracting hikers who enjoyed a challenge. That evening, the sun cast golden rays through the treetops as I had been walking for several hours. The only sounds were the rustling leaves in the wind. I had planned to find a campsite near a small creek for the night, but darkness fell quicker than expected. As I hurried along, I suddenly noticed a small cabin appearing in the shadows of the trees ahead. The cabin looked very old, with weathered wooden boards and a half-open door that gave off an eerie vibe. I hesitated for a moment, but with the night closing in, I decided to take a closer look. The door was unlocked, and as I gently pushed it open, I found a simple yet tidy interior. There was a wooden table with an old-fashioned oil lamp and a cup of clear water. I thought perhaps this cabin was a shelter for lost hikers. I sat down at the table and took a few sips of water, feeling warmth spread through me. As night completely fell and the chill outside grew more intense, I decided to stay in the cabin for the night. But as I was about to close the door, I heard a low, steady sound of footsteps in the distance. The sound wasn't fast but was rhythmic, like someone was slowly approaching through the woods. My heart started to race as I couldn't imagine who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere. I nervously shut the door and cautiously peered out the window, noticing a shadow moving among the trees. The steps were steady and slow, as if the figure wasn't in a hurry to reach the cabin. The footsteps grew louder, yet I still couldn't make out the figure's details. Just as I was about to extinguish the oil lamp and hide, the shadow suddenly stopped, standing silently not far from the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, but I dared not make a sound. After a moment, the shadow seemed to turn and slowly move away, the footsteps fading into the night. I breathed a sigh of relief but remained on edge. That night, I barely slept, always feeling like someone was lingering outside. At dawn, I couldn't resist opening the door to check the surroundings and was shocked to find deep footprints in the ground outside. The footprints led into the woods and disappeared among the trees. I quickly gathered my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. It wasn't until I returned to town that I realized the cabin wasn't marked on any map, and no one had ever heard of such a shelter. Who or what was approaching that night, and why it vanished without a trace, remains a mystery that still haunts me. I live on the outskirts of a newly developed community, surrounded by vast, untouched land and a few nature reserves yet to be fully explored. The nights here are quiet and mysterious, with only the occasional sound of distant traffic breaking the silence, as if everything is submerged in a silent darkness. One autumn night in 2023, I decided to take a walk along the edge of one of these reserves, where a newly paved path had recently attracted many residents and visitors during the day. I prefer solitude, so I chose to go out late at night, when almost no one would be in the area. Holding a flashlight in my hand, I slowly ventured into the dim forest. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and earth, my footsteps crunching softly on the soft ground. The surrounding silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance, making the darkness feel even more oppressive. After walking for a while, I grew tired and sat down on an abandoned bench. The path continued deeper into the forest, where no lights had been installed. The tall, ominous trees blocked out the starlight, making it feel like I was standing in an endless void. Just as I was about to get up and continue my walk, I suddenly heard faint footsteps approaching from behind. I stopped and gripped my flashlight tightly, quickly turning to face the source of the sound. About 15 feet away, I saw a tall figure standing behind a tree, shrouded in shadow. My heart raced as I tried to steady myself, attempting to make out what it was. But the flashlight's beam was too weak, and I could only see that the person was wearing a black hat, with a slim, straight figure. Cautiously, I took a step closer, the beam gradually revealing more of the figure, pale, indistinct face, void of any discernible features, giving off an eerie impression. What was even more unsettling was the rusted metal rod the figure held in his hand, wrapped in what appeared to be old, torn cloth. I suddenly realized I might be in grave danger. In that moment, my mind flashed back to rumors I had heard. Just days ago, a missing woman's body had been found on the other side of the reserve, suspected to be the victim of an attack. Despite the area's reputation for safety, the news still sent chills down my spine. "Who are you?" I tried to ask calmly, but my voice trembled, betraying my fear. He didn't answer, remaining still and silent, just staring at me. I couldn't wait any longer. The fear surged through me, pumping adrenaline into my veins. I turned and ran as fast as I could back the way I had come. The footsteps behind me quickened. He was chasing me. I didn't dare look back, only focusing on running, the flashlight shaking wildly in my hand, its light threatening to flicker out. The sound of his breathing grew closer, as if he were right behind me. Suddenly, in my panic, I stepped on a loose rock and lost my balance, crashing to the ground. The flashlight flew out of my hand, rolling away. Pain shot through my knee, but I had no time to dwell on it. I scrambled to my feet, ready to continue my escape. But the footsteps had stopped. I grabbed the flashlight with trembling hands and pointed it behind me. He was standing just a few feet away, holding the metal rod, his head slightly bowed as if he were studying me. The tension in the air was suffocating, as if time itself had stopped. I stared at him, my mind racing to find a way out. Suddenly, he turned and walked into the darkness, slowly disappearing from my sight. My heart was still pounding, almost unable to believe what I had just experienced. I stood there, legs weak, sweat pouring down my back. It wasn't until I was sure he was gone that I shakily began walking again, running out of the forest. When I finally saw the streetlights, the tension broke, and I nearly collapsed to the ground. That night, I never returned to the reserve. Even during the day, the shadow of that forest loomed in my mind. Even long after, I would lie awake at night, haunted by the memory of that pale, indistinct face, the rusted metal rod, and the terrifying silence. Embark on a solo hike through an ancient, scarcely trodden forest. Deep within the forest lies a long-abandoned cabin, rumored to be the site of several mysterious disappearances. Curiosity got the better of me, and I set out to investigate. At first, the forest was peaceful, with only the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves breaking the silence. As I ventured deeper, the fog thickened, and visibility grew dim. The ground was soft and spongy, and each step seemed to echo louder than usual. I followed a narrow, barely visible path, and soon began to hear faint, rhythmic footsteps behind me. Initially, I thought it might be small animals, but the pattern seemed deliberate. I turned around but saw nothing. As the fog grew denser, strange whispers seemed to drift on the wind, adding to my unease. Eventually, I reached the cabin. It stood in a clearing, its decrepit structure partially collapsed and overgrown. The door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, with an old mirror hanging crookedly on one wall. Dust and cobwebs covered the mirror's surface. As I approached the mirror, I noticed something unsettling. A pair of eerie eyes reflected back at me from the glass. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out as I tried to discern what I was seeing. Suddenly, I heard a low, rhythmic breathing from outside the cabin. My pulse quickened as I tried to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. The mirror seemed to shift, and I caught a glimpse of shadowy figures in its reflection. Fear overwhelmed me, and I turned to leave, only to find that the door had somehow closed behind me. I struggled to push it open, my hands shaking. The breathing grew louder and more intense. Desperately, I burst through the door and fled into the fog. The path twisted and turned, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I could hear footsteps gaining on me, their rhythm in sync with my panicked breathing. Reaching an open clearing, I glanced back to see the cabin and the encroaching mist. With adrenaline fueling my escape, I dashed towards my car, parked at the edge of the forest. I drove away as fast as I could, my heart still pounding, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Looking back at the fog-enshrouded forest, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The tales of the cabin and the forest had never felt so real, and I knew I would never return to that ominous place.